Recording in progress.
Dear beloved community, what a joy it is to be together with you this evening. Here in Sydney and in the surroundings of Sydney, we've just begun a 2-week lockdown with stay-at-home orders. Since the stay-at-home, the lockdown was announced yesterday, I've been reflecting on these 3 words, stay at home. Over the past year, I've heard a lot of friends and practitioners share that staying at home is the basic Buddhist practice. While I agree that it's the basic practice in the sense of basic meaning fundamental, it's also at the same time the fruit, the culmination of our practice of deep looking. It seems to me that to truly develop the capacity to stay at home, we need to cultivate the following steps. The first step I call recognition. Recognition is one of the distinguishing characteristics of this quality that we call mindfulness. It's important to know what your true home really is. If we don't know what our true home is, what qualities it contains, then how can we discover it? How can we dwell in it? And also, it's important to consider whether the home that we dwell in each and every moment, home here meaning mind states, habit energies, and so forth, is indeed our true home, our ultimate home. Knowing, of course, that any ideas or notions that we have of the ultimate cannot even begin to describe the reality. Or whether our home is actually the seemingly comfortable place that the Buddha describes as the home that we've built around ourselves, made up of our entrenchments, our habit energies. The second aspect, the second practice, once we've identified our true home, the qualities of mind and heart that we want to cultivate and to dwell in, is to develop the capacity to return to those qualities, to return to this home, this place, over and over again. This is the practice that I call returning. So first we have recognizing, and then we have returning. This is the practice that we speak of in the Gatha that we recite in Plum Village whenever we hear the sound of the bell. Listen, listen, This wonderful sound brings me back to my true home. We practice over and over again to return home. And the third aspect, the third concrete practice that blossoms out of developing these capacities, I call remaining. We remain in our true home. Te calls this the portable Pure Land. So staying at home is both a concrete practice and a fruit of the practice. Tonight we've arrived at the final poem in the Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights. What a journey we've had over the past 6 months or so. Tonight we'll be exploring a few of the key themes in Discourse number 16, poem number 16 in the Book of Eights, which is called the Discourse to Sariputra. I thought it might be helpful, since this is the very last poem in this series, to have a little recap. One of the key themes that we've been exploring in the Book of Eights, the Atthakavagga, is around the 4 types of clinging. Our desperate clinging and attachment to sensual desires, to views, to habits and entrenchments, to practices and precepts, and to ideas of the self, which give us a false sense of comfort. Overall, it could be said that there are 4 main themes in the Book of Eights. The first is developing awareness of and transforming sensual desire. The second is recognizing our tendency towards views and letting go of them. The third is a description of the qualities of a wise one, a sage or a wise person. And the fourth is the training to become wise. So the first theme of recognizing and transforming our tendency towards sensual desire is one of the main themes that's woven through this text. We're reminded in this text that as humans we have a tendency to be pulled in many directions through our sense doors, running after what we call pleasant sights, sounds, smells, touches, tastes, and so on, and running away from what we call unpleasant sounds, smells, touches, tastes, and so on. And if we continue to do this, we'll eventually, as we've read in the Book of Eights, be overwhelmed by dangers and penetrated by suffering as water penetrates a cracked boat. This is quite a different approach to the one we're used to, and that in many ways our brain is hardwired to, the continual search outside for something, anything really, to grasp onto. At its essence, Buddhist practice is about disentanglement. In the previous poem that we've been exploring over the past 2 weeks, we discovered liberation being described as unbinding, being radically free from being entangled in this world of samsara, in the world of our carefully cultivated dissatisfaction. This theme runs throughout the Book of Eights, sometimes in subtle terms and sometimes really emphatically. Remember that the focus is not that there's a problem with sensory inputs themselves. There's not. Rather, it's with our habitual and our blind responses to them, our clinging, our thrashing around. The second theme that's woven through the Book of Eights is the practice of letting go of views. The Book of Eights emphasizes this quality, which is very important to us, the importance of recognizing and then not clinging to any opinions, philosophies, doctrines, or religious teachings, including views about ultimate truth. Any view of ultimate truth will, by its very nature and by the nature of ultimate truth, be incomplete. We're reminded in the Book of Eights that to find peace with a capital P, we should practice to recognize and release all views without embracing or rejecting anything. And this also includes views about letting go of views. There are a number of times in which the text reminds us of the danger in believing that our views or our way of practice is the most correct, and that others are not up to scratch. I consider this to be a radical and timely message. I feel like we need this message now more than ever. This is so counter to our way of thinking and interacting on an individual and a collective level. The Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights, reminds us that clinging to views doesn't lead to lasting peace at most, but let's face it, not very often it'll lead to a temporary ceasefire. Letting go of views might seem a little bit confusing, because most things in our shared reality are based on a particular worldview. What's left when we lay down our views? In the Majjhima Nikaya, I've spoken about this text before, but I want to emphasize it here again. There's a discourse called the Honey Bowl Discourse. And in this discourse, the Buddha says that his teaching is a teaching with which one does not argue with anyone in the world. It's a teaching where a person who lives uninvolved with seeking and who is free of doubt, of worry, and of craving, and does not cling to concepts. This is what I teach. Freedom, liberation, or to use the term, that beautiful and evocative term that we discovered in the last poem, unbinding, doesn't come about through doctrines, through ideas or notions or rites or rituals or habits, but through applying the practices that we're offered, even the seemingly most simple, so that we're able to let go of views, notions, and touch what has been there all along. A third theme in the Book of Eights is the quality of a wise one, or as it's termed within the text itself, the sage. A wise or a worthy one in Buddhism, or in the framework of the Book of Eights specifically, is someone who's able to generate and realize peace, liberation, and freedom for themselves. They're not reliant on anyone or anything external anymore. A true worthy one is someone who's let go of all of the desperate grasping and clinging. Rather than a spiritual attainment that's separate from how we live our lives, there's a strong focus on the fact that the depth of a person's insight is demonstrated through the way in which they engage with every action. This is true of the Plum Village tradition. There's very little time and very little attention for any great claims of someone who cannot walk mindfully, close a door mindfully and gently, for example. Mindfulness is as mindfulness does. We're lucky enough to have had a teacher such as Thay, who taught with his every action and not just through words. If we consider ourselves a continuation of our teacher, a student of Thay, then that would be the greatest gift, to inhabit each and every experience of your life just as it is, the pleasant, the slow, the gentle, the painful, the hard, the fast, as a sacred moment, and not to struggle anymore. There's one more aspect to mention. Many of us think in terms of attainments with regard to the spiritual path. This idea, this mindset has infiltrated our vocabulary around spiritual life. Getting enlightened, attaining liberation, getting happy, becoming peaceful, getting something. In the Book of Eights, a wise person doesn't get anything. Rather, the emphasis in the Book of Eights is not on getting something or attaining something that we think that we lack, but rather it is on letting go of, releasing things, releasing the layers that are covering up that which has been there all along and is our birthright. I think this is a sea change from our usual way of viewing things. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. The fourth key theme in the Book of Eights is that of training. While all of the chapters of the Book of Eights discuss what someone on the path engages and doesn't engage with, the last 3 poems that we've been exploring over the past month or so focus primarily on this theme, the training to become wise. The Book of Eights itself focuses on transformation and on each of us taking responsibility for that. In focusing on cultivating behaviors and qualities in a practitioner, the Book of Eights doesn't emphasize religious practices that can be seen as steps toward, or as we might put it today, a checklist for attaining the qualities of the ideal person. This is the temptation of our modern society, and particularly of consumerism. And we bring this consumerism and this consumeristic tendency often to our spiritual life, of seeing practice as a set of techniques. Press a button and get something, rather than an ever-unfolding path. The Book of Eights encourages each of us to simply behave as a wise person. It's almost as if we're being reminded to, for goodness sake, stop reading about it, stop talking about it, stop thinking about it, stop analyzing it and messing around, and just do it. Practices in Buddhism are seen as both the way to cultivate and the very goal or the fruit of that cultivation itself. Just like Thea said, there's no way to peace. Peace is the way. This final poem in the collection, and yes, we've arrived at the final poem in the collection. For those of you who've been wondering when we'll begin talking about the poem, is called the Discourse to Sariputra and is quite different in tone from the earlier poems in the collection. And it's the only poem that focuses exclusively on this training and doesn't address the other 3 themes that we spoke about earlier. Additionally, this is the only poem in the entire Book of Eights that contains the word Buddha in its verses. It's also much more deferential to the person of the Buddha than in previous poems. Looking at the Book of Eights as a whole, we might consider that the early poems present the Buddha's insight on the qualities of a wise person, and the final poems provide the Buddha's guidance on how to become a wise one. In this poem, the Buddha specifically addresses monastics. As we've shared earlier, this can be approached by each one of us, even if we're not a monastic, in terms of understanding that the Buddha is addressing those who have left home and leaving the unstable home of our usual entrenchments to find our true home that's been right under our feet all along is our every moment practice. The path of practice that we're offered in the Book of Eights is described both as qualities to nurture and qualities to let go of. Peace and inclusiveness are emphasized as the qualities to nurture, and grasping, craving, getting stuck in a rut, and quarreling are the qualities to let go of. In this poem, the first 8 or so verses are in the form of questions presented by the Buddha's senior disciple Sariputra. In the Plum Village tradition, every time we touch the earth to pay our respects to the Buddha's senior disciples. One of the Buddha's most senior students was Sariputra. He had an amazing life, and many wonderful stories are told about his life and his family, his mother. I always encourage my friends to learn more about the senior students of the Buddha, since each of them has a backstory. And it's important to know these stories, to understand who these wonderful disciples were. They were real people. There's a wonderful book called Great Disciples of the Buddha that shares with us many of these stories, some of them deep and profound and some quite humorous, which, if you ask me, is another way of being deep and profound. I wholeheartedly recommend that book, Great Disciples of the Buddha. This book is helpful because if we're able to meet and understand these figures that we encounter in the canon on a deeper level than just the names, we understand how they themselves manifested this wisdom in their life. And we understand that it's possible, and not only possible, it's probable that if we embark on this journey, that we can do the same. In earlier poems, we've noticed that there was an emphasis, perhaps, on what not to do, on what to let go of, rather than what to undertake. Here in this poem, the Buddha offers us a set of practices to undertake. So the poem begins with a sharing and some questions from the Venerable Sariputra. Never before have I seen or heard from anyone of a teacher with such lovely speech, come together with his following from Tushita heaven, as the one with eyes who appears to the world with its divine beings, having dispelled all darkness, having arrived at delight by himself alone. So here in this verse we see an honoring, a reverence to the Buddha that's much more intense than in previous poems. We also read the line, the one with eyes. Throughout the Book of Eights, a wise person, a sage, has been described as one who knows and sees. So I invite each of my friends, each of you, to reflect on your own experience and consider what might be meant by this phrase, one who knows and sees. What does it mean to you to know and to see in your own experience? There are many layers, but one approach could be to understand it in terms of inner knowing and outer manifestation. In other words, applying the insight that we've generated to each and every moment of our daily life. This is also our teacher Tay's primary invitation. And this is the hallmark of a real practitioner. Insight has very little benefit if it's not applied. The one with eyes in the context of this stanza, of course, means one who sees clearly. But it might be also helpful to share that in Buddhism, we also speak of five eyes, which would probably be a great topic for another series of talks, namely the physical or fleshly eye, the divine eye, the wisdom eye, the Dharma eye, and the Buddha eye. These are the five eyes that are traditionally shared about in Buddhism. In the Plum Village tradition, we add a sixth that we feel is particularly important in this modern society, and that's the Sangha eye. This is a deep trust in the fact that the wisdom of the community is deeper and vaster than any one individual. So often we hold back because at a fundamental level, we don't really trust the community. Any insight that's real and that's true must be a collective insight. And then the poem continues, to the Buddha who is independent, unentangled, undeceitful, who is thus, who has come with his followers, I ask a question on behalf of the many here who are entangled. Independent here means having liberated themselves. So as we shared earlier, not dependent on anything outside anymore. Somebody who has woken up, who has had an unbinding experience, who's liberating their heart, is considered to be independent, well established. So this is the meaning of that word independent in the verse. And then there's another word that's quite interesting in this verse, in this verse, and that's the word thus. It's tading in Pali. It literally means the one who is of such qualities. It's similar in meaning to Tathagata, which is a term that is used to describe the Buddha, the thus come one, or the one who has come from suchness and will return to suchness. So here we have a similar word, tading, meaning thus, the one who is thus, the one who is of such qualities. The poem continues with Sariputra's question. For a monastic disaffected, who frequents empty places, the root of a tree, a cemetery, and mountain caves, various places to stay. How many are the fears there at which they shouldn't tremble, dwelling in quiet places? How many are the dangers in the world for the monastic, dwelling in a quiet place and going in the direction they never have gone? So let's have a look first at the word monastic. It's important to mention that these verses were, of course, originally composed for a monastic audience, but they're essential teachings for each of us, whether we're a monastic or we're a householder. Even the passages referring directly to the homeless life can be seen in a deep way and apply to us all. In fact, in one other sutra, Venerable Mahakaccayana, who is one of the Buddha's other senior disciples, was commenting on a verse describing the behavior of a person who has abandoned home and society. And he interprets the word home as the five skandhas and society as sense impressions. So we can see that the verse here, this word here, also has an internal meaning that each of us can apply to our situation. In the first line of this stanza, there's another word, disaffected, vijiguchato in Pali. This Pali word is quite hard to translate. It has many layers of meaning. It can mean to loathe, to be concerned about, to be disgusted, and so on. But in this context, I feel the meaning is more like disenchanted. It doesn't mean bummed out, down in the dumps, or emo, but it means that the stardust has fallen from your eyes and you're not interested in the shiny, pretty things anymore. Other things become more interesting. A couple of years ago, someone was telling me about a show called Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I responded that I don't need to keep up with the Kardashians. I don't need to keep up with anybody else. I have enough work, I have enough practice to just keep up with my own breath, to keep up with my own step. That's more than enough to keep up with right there. So this is what's meant by being disenchanted, by not being caught up in the shiny, pretty things that are everywhere. And then we have the line, we shouldn't tremble while dwelling in quiet places. This is an interesting line, isn't it? We shouldn't tremble while dwelling in quiet places. I wonder what you think it might mean. Often we fill our minds and our lives with so much stuff that being alone and doing nothing can be scary. I've shared previously about the series of 11 studies done by University of Virginia psychologist Timothy Wilson and his colleagues at Harvard University, which found that study participants from a range of ages between 18 and 77 generally did not enjoy spending even brief periods of time alone in a room with nothing to do but to think, to ponder, or daydream. The participants by and large enjoyed much more doing external activities such as listening to music or using a smartphone. The period of time that participants were asked to be alone with their thoughts ranged from 6 to 15 minutes. The researchers didn't necessarily attribute this to the fast pace of modern society or to the prevalence of electronic devices like smartphones. Instead, they theorized that the constant use of devices might be a response to people's desire to always have something to do. And from a Buddhist psychological perspective, we would understand that this is definitely the nature of our mind. Our mind is hardwired this way. The researchers noted that broad surveys have shown that people generally prefer not to disengage with the world, and when they do, they don't tend to particularly enjoy it. During several of the experiments, participants were asked to sit alone in an unadorned room at a laboratory with no cell phone, no reading materials or writing implements, and to spend 6 to 15 minutes, depending on the study, entertaining themselves with their thoughts. Which, for all of us meditators right now, we know that it can actually be quite entertaining to sit and observe your thoughts. Oh, the stories. Afterward, they answered questions. The study participants, not the meditators, answered questions about how much they enjoyed the experience, although that might be a good thing to do as well, to ask the meditators how much they enjoyed the experience. And the study participants were asked if they had difficulty concentrating, among other questions. Most reported that they found it difficult to concentrate and that their minds wandered, though nothing was competing for their attention. On average, the participants did not enjoy the experience. An additional experiment randomly assigned participants to spend time with their thoughts, or the same amount of time doing an external activity such as reading or listening to music, but not to communicate with others. Those who did the external activities reported that they enjoyed themselves much more than those just asked to sit and think, that they found it much easier to concentrate, and that their minds wandered less. So the researchers took their studies further. Because most people preferred having something to do rather than to just sit and to do nothing but be with their thoughts, they then asked, would they rather do an unpleasant activity rather than no activity at all? The results show that many would. Participants were given the same circumstances as most of the previous studies, with the added option of also administering a mild electric shock to themselves by pressing a button. 12 of 18 male-identified people in the study gave themselves at least one electric shock during the study's 15-minute silent thinking period. We would call that the meditation period. By comparison, 6 of 24 female-identified people shocked themselves. All of the participants had received a prior sample of the shock and reported that they would pay to avoid being shocked again. What's striking, the investigators wrote, is that simply being alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes was apparently so aversive that it drove many participants to self-administer an electric shock that earlier they said they would pay to avoid. For a meditator, we're actually delighted to have time like this, to have time in which to do nothing, to have time to sit, to follow our breathing, to simply be with our experience. And it's essential and important, though, not to approach our meditation like another task, another thing to do. Speaking of doing nothing, of just coming back to our breathing, of being with our experience, let's enjoy a sound of the bell. We read another interesting line in this stanza, going where they have never gone. And this is an allusion to liberation, to nirvana, to freedom. It's also an invitation to keep going, to not get stuck, to not just remain where we are with our insight or our spiritual development, but to keep going further, to be willing to let go of the insights and discoveries that we've had up to now so that new growth can manifest, to go where we've never gone before. And then the poem continues, for resolute practitioners, what should be the ways of their speech? What should be the range of their action? What should be their mindfulness trainings and their practices? What training should they take on, those who are solitary, wise and mindful, to purify their own impurities as a silversmith purifies those in molten silver? Solitary, ekodi. Eka means one, in and of itself, or in some contexts purified. Speaking of solitary, there's a beautiful Pali word that we encounter in this text, viveka. It can be translated in many ways, like mental seclusion. But it's also the capacity to distinguish between what's real and what's unreal. This quality is a very beautiful quality in these core teachings of Buddhism. And it depends on letting go of grasping after these external sensual desires, this continual search outside of ourselves. Viveka, solitude, is more than just being alone. It has three aspects. The first is kaya viveka, physical solitude, which means, of course, physical solitude, but also the letting go of too much luxury. The second is chitta viveka, which means mental solitude, meaning that when our mind has stopped running after external things, and we become our own place of refuge. The third is upadhi viveka, solitude, meaning one who has become liberated, one who is independent, as we heard earlier in tonight's poem. And then the Buddha begins to respond to Sariputra's questions. I will tell you as one who knows what is comfort for one disaffected, who frequents secluded places, desiring self-awakening in line with the Dharma. Earlier in this poem, Sariputra refers to the Buddha as the one with eyes, or in other words, the one who sees. Here in this stanza, the Buddha responds using the phrase, as one who knows. What a lovely counterpoint. Basically, in this stanza, the Buddha is saying, let me tell you where real comfort can be found if you're experiencing this sense of disillusionment and you wish to wake up to your real situation. The poem continues, wise monastics, mindful and living restrained, shouldn't fear the 5 fears. And then here the Buddha goes through a list of 5 fears, some of which might be a little surprising. Of horseflies, of mosquitoes, of snakes, of 4-footed beings, and of human contact. Basically, this is a list of a number of insect or animal disturbances that can occur when in the forest. I remember when I was practicing in Sri Lanka, the mosquitoes can be very intense. Also, on my walking meditation path, the walking meditation path outside that I had, it was about 20 paces long, a little bit like a cricket pitch for the Australian friends who are listening to this talk, or the friends from the UK or India listening to this talk. There was a cobra hole, and so that was always a good reminder. Among this list of animals and insects, we have the phrase human contact, which is a translation of the word phassa, which means sense contact, as we've discussed in previous talks. The poem continues, they shouldn't be fazed by those following another's teaching, even on seeing their manifold threats. Seeing what's skillful, they should overcome still all other dangers. Seeing what's skillful means recognizing and nurturing the skillful seeds in our consciousness, and also considering always whether our actions of body, speech, and mind are in line with our deepest aspiration, are in line with generating that quality of our true home that we've been speaking of this evening. The poem continues, they should endure cold and extreme heat and contact with sickness, hunger, and thirst. Touched by these in many ways, those homeless ones should make an effort and be firm in their execution. There's always something in this realm of samsara that will not be quite right. That's just the nature of things here. The tendency of our mind is also to seek out something not perfect in each moment. One family member of mine has a personal vendetta against the winter. I'm not going to mention who they are. They'll probably never listen to this, but I will not mention who they are. I should probably say right now that this family member of mine who has a personal vendetta against the winter lives in a subtropical part of Australia, not anywhere like the Blue Mountains where it's quite cold. However, living in the subtropical part, they still suffer a lot with the colder time of the year, but it's pretty relative. However, from the first part of autumn until the mid-spring, one can expect to see many posts and updates about how they hate the winter. Often there's even a day-by-day count of how many days are left until the winter is over. But funnily enough, I've also noticed as well that there are posts in the middle of the summer that complain about the heat of the summer. External conditions are such. It's the nature of things. It's always going to feel either a little bit too cold or quite a bit too cold, a little bit too hot or quite a bit too hot. Or if those things are not affecting us, then maybe there are mosquitoes. If the mosquitoes are not affecting us, we may have a headache. If we don't have those things affecting us, we may feel thirsty. If we don't have those things affecting us, we might have a backache, and so on. This is the nature of things in this realm. This is what actually the ground of our practice. This is what we have to practice with. Our practice doesn't consist of other things. Our practice consists of bringing our mindful attention to these experiences just as they are, the joyful things, the challenging things, the backache, the headache, the cold, the hot, and noting our responses to them, becoming interested in our responses to them. The poem continues, they shouldn't steal or lie. They should touch with loving kindness those who tremble or are firm. Whatever disturbance they know in their minds, they should transform. Knowing it's not conducive, or another translation of this line is, knowing that it belongs to the dark side, they should touch with loving kindness those who tremble or are firm. Last year, I offered a 6-week class on the Discourse on Love, a few sessions during the year. In this class, as we explored that sutra, the Discourse on Love, we came across a very similar line to the line, they should touch with loving kindness those who tremble or are firm. In the class, I mentioned that when we read this line, when we read the similar line in the Discourse on Love, we usually think of other living beings, people, animals, insects, and so on. However, it's equally valid and equally important to consider the parts of ourselves or our experience that are currently frail or trembling, or firm and solid. There's a line in this stanza, whatever disturbance they know in their minds, they should transform. This is the very basis, the very essence of Buddhist practice, right in this line. Transforming the seeds in our consciousness. Notice that we speak of transformation. Something cannot become nothing. So don't try to approach your practice like a ninja chopping away at things. That would be pointless, and you'll just be creating another war. Wisdom arises when we shine the light of awareness on the things that are arising within our experience, and we see them for what they are. Or perhaps we're willing to see them for what they are. Knowing it's not conducive in this stanza can also be translated, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, as knowing that it belongs to the dark side, which I think is a very powerful translation. I remember seeing a poster somewhere that said, "Come to the dark side, we have cookies." The poem continues, we shouldn't come under the sway of anger or conceit. Having dug up their root, they would stand firm. Masters, they would overcome what is cherished and what is not. Revering wisdom, delighting in what is admirable, they should overcome those dangers. In isolated places, they should transform discontent. They should transform the 4 reasons for despair. What will I eat? Where will I eat? How badly I slept. Tonight, where will I sleep? Those who wander homeless, who are in training, should transform those despairing thoughts. These poems were composed at a very early stage in Buddhist development, mainly before the establishment of permanent monasteries. Monastics at the time were primarily wanderers, spending 3 nights at the foot of a tree at most. You might think that this would make it very easy to be unattached, but friends, it's quite amazing how entrenched one can become in 3 nights. Since monastics are reliant on the kindness of others, the thought of what will I eat, where will I eat, and so on can become a major preoccupation in their minds. The poem continues, receiving food and cloth at appropriate times, they should have a sense of enough for the sake of contentment. Guarded in regard to these things and restrained in a village, even when offended, they would not say a harsh word. 3 robes and a bowl, it's so easy to accumulate stuff or become fixated and picky about it. In monastic life, we are to have 3 robes, 3 sets of clothes, and a bowl. Everything else is just extra. But even with 3 robes and a bowl, it's quite easy to become very particular. Our minds work like that. Over the course of 26 centuries, the monastic community has had a lot of experience in this. There's the phrase, the sense of enough. And our teacher Tay has offered us a beautiful practice in the 3 words he invites us to contemplate and to practice. I have enough. My first book, which is called Nothing to It, was based on a winter retreat course that I offered. I think it was back in 2011 or so. And it was originally called The 10 Gates. We ended up not being able to use that title since it was already taken as the title of another book. And Parallax Press, the publisher, proposed calling the book Enough. I reflected on it, but I felt calling the book Enough might not convey the contents of the book as much as I'd like. So in the end, the title Nothing to It was proposed. So that's how the first book got the title Nothing to It. The poem continues, with eyes downcast and not agitated, practicing meditation. They should be continually wakeful, composed, centered within, and equanimous. They should cut off the tendency to doubt and to worry. If you spend time with monastics, you'll notice that as we walk or engage in our day, we're usually not glancing around here and there, but we practice to keep our eyes in front of us. The reason for this is so that it comes back to the fact that in the ancient texts we're often invited to keep to bring our meditation object before us, and also that there's a sense that if we're looking around here and there that we're not really centered because body and mind are united. So we also don't want to be doing too many things at once. We want to really focus on whatever we're doing. So we'll tend to turn our whole bodies in certain directions when we want to look in certain ways, or we'll keep our eyes about 3 or 4 yards in front of us. There's a line here that says, mindful they'll be happy and rejoice when reprimanded. Our usual tendency is to get all riled up and defensive when anyone even offers us a word of criticism. Here we're invited to rejoice. And in fact, this is a practice that we find in other sutras, such as the Discourse on Measuring and Reflecting and so on. If somebody is so kind as to offer us a reprimand, then actually we're very lucky because that person still has confidence in us to be able to share that with us. And the fact that we can receive it, we can be open to it and not become defensive about it, not explain away all these different reasons for something, but to be able to take it on board, to look at it and to examine whether it is a correct observation or whether perhaps there are other ways to see it, is an important practice for each one of us. It's a very hopeful and joyful moment when somebody offers us a reprimand. The poem continues, they should smash any rigidity and surliness towards other practitioners. We each think that our way of practice is the way with a capital W. So what an important invitation is offered here by the Buddha. I'm reminded of that delightful discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya called Atthakavagga, where the monastics are all sitting in a Dharma discussion, and the question is, what's an ideal practitioner? And we have a number of the senior disciples of the Buddha sitting in that circle, and we the senior disciples are all known as the foremost in something or other, or the best in something or other. Like somebody was the foremost in meditation, another one was the foremost in dwelling in the forest, and so on. So in this discussion, each of the senior disciples of the Buddha shares that the ideal practitioner is someone who has the quality that they themselves are foremost in. For example, the senior disciple who's foremost in meditation says the ideal or the best practitioner, the practitioner that illuminates the forest, is a practitioner who is dedicated to meditation, has a lot of fruit of meditation, and so on. And each of the disciples shares in that way that the qualities that they themselves possess are the qualities of an ideal practitioner. And what's beautiful is everybody just listens to it and agrees and doesn't argue with each other. Everybody's okay with it. And then the Buddha comes along, and the Buddha says, so what are you all talking about here? And they share their discussion with the Buddha. And then one of the senior disciples asks the Buddha the question. So, dear world-honored one, we've all shared who we feel illuminates the forest. Who do you say illuminates the forest? Who do you say is the ideal practitioner? And the Buddha says, for me, the ideal practitioner is not necessarily, and I'm paraphrasing, but not necessarily someone who's the foremost in anything, but someone who is dedicated to their path, makes much of their path, and keeps going. So I think that's an important teaching for us. Not everybody needs to be exactly the same. We all have our tendencies. We all have our strengths, and we all have our opportunities. Notice I didn't say weaknesses, I said opportunities. The poem continues, they will speak skillfully and not excessively, and not think about things that people gossip about. And further, mindfully they will train to remove the 5 stains of the world. They will transform passion with regard to form, sound, tastes, smells, and touch. A monastic, mindful, with a well-liberated mind, contemplating the right Dharma at the right times, on coming to oneness, on becoming concentrated. They should annihilate the darkness, the Blessed One said. That's a beautiful translation of samadhi, coming to oneness. I've tended lately, instead of using concentration, because in our modern society we equate concentration with a lot of mental effort, I've been using immersion. But I also like this, of coming to oneness, of becoming one with the object of our attention. This text, as short as it is, contains a radical message that offers an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. It almost has the sense of dropping the mic to each one of us to stop messing around and to cultivate and live within a deep sense of each and every moment, right here and right now. To take advantage of each and every moment that we're offered, to be able to cultivate this quality of attentiveness that we call mindfulness to each and every moment. One thing that we will notice as we explore this text within these verses is that reality is not divided into a worldly realm and a transcendent realm separate from everyday life. Instead, we're reminded in this poem and in the Book of Eights in general that peace, everyday peace, and the peace of liberation is to be touched right here and right now, not sometime in the future or somewhere else, but right where you are, right in this moment. From the bottom of my heart, I hope that you've enjoyed this brief journey into the riches contained in tonight's poem and in this ancient text, the Book of Eights. which contains in seed form many of the insights and the teachings of the Buddha, which have continued to blossom and flower right to this very day. And they'll continue to blossom and flower long into the future in many wonderful and probably surprising ways. It's been an absolute joy to walk this path of the Book of Eights and all the other series so far that we've explored together over the past year and a half. And I wish each of you every joy and every success in your practice now and always. We'll end with 3 sounds of the bell.